Everyone always said Habiba was lucky. Her husband, Nkosi, was a successful and handsome businessman. People admired their marriage and thought they were the perfect couple, but no one knew how much Habiba had sacrificed for him. She was the one who stood beside him when he had nothing. She prayed for him when his business kept failing, and she gave up her own dreams just to support his. She cooked, cleaned, and stayed patient through the hard times. So when Nkosi brought home a young woman named Ziza and said, "She's just my employee," Habiba didn't complain. She smiled and welcomed her like a good wife should. She even served her tea with her own hands. She trusted Nkosi because that's what love does. It trusts. But deep inside, something didn't feel right. Then, one night, Habiba walked into Nkosi's study and saw 2 teacups on his side table. He always drank alone, so why 2 cups? She stood still, her heart sinking slowly. Her eyes moved around the room, and that's when she noticed something else. Her favorite gold necklace, the one Nkosi gave her on their first anniversary, was missing from her drawer. She didn't scream. She didn't break anything. She just stood there, holding back her tears. In that quiet moment, she felt something shift in her heart, something cold, something heavy. It was the first crack, the first sign that maybe she wasn't imagining things. Maybe Ziza wasn't just an employee. Habiba smiled in front of everyone the next day, like nothing was wrong. She served breakfast, like always. But inside, she had started asking questions, quiet questions, silent ones, the kind that keep you awake at night. Because sometimes, betrayal doesn't start with a fight. It starts with 2 teacups and a missing necklace. Habiba didn't sleep much after that night. Her mind kept going back to the 2 teacups, to the missing necklace, to the little smiles Ziza gave Nkosi when she thought no one was watching. Something didn't feel right, but every time she tried to speak, someone told her to stay quiet. Her sister was the first. "Don't say anything, Habiba," she warned. "You'll ruin your own home. Men make mistakes. Just ignore it and protect your marriage." Then her mother said the same thing. "This is how men are, my daughter. They wander, but they always come back. Be patient. Don't create drama." Even Nkosi made her feel foolish. When she asked about Ziza, he laughed and said, "You always overthink. She's just someone who helps me with the business. You're making a problem where there is none." Habiba tried to believe him. She really did. But every time Ziza entered the room, it felt like something was being taken from her. Slowly, silently. Ziza no longer acted like a guest. She started sitting at the table before Habiba. She gave orders to the housemaid. She laughed too loudly at Nkosi's jokes. She looked too comfortable, too familiar. What hurt the most wasn't what Ziza was doing. It was what Nkosi wasn't doing. He wasn't stopping it. He wasn't choosing her. He wasn't even noticing how uncomfortable she felt. It was like Habiba's presence had become invisible in her own home. She remembered the early days of their marriage, when they had no money and no generator. Nkosi couldn't afford fancy dinners, so she would decorate their small table with candles and serve boiled yam with a smile. They would laugh through the darkness and dream of better days. That table was their little world, their hope, their beginning. Now that same table felt like a stage where she was being slowly replaced. Habiba didn't scream, she didn't argue, but inside, something was breaking. Not her mind, like they all said, but her heart. Every day, a small part of it chipped away, and all she kept hearing was, "Keep quiet, don't make noise, be a good wife." But deep down, she knew silence wasn't saving her. It was slowly erasing her. Habiba was in the kitchen, cutting vegetables for dinner, when Ziza walked in with her usual loud heels and fake smile. She leaned against the counter, watching Habiba quietly for a few seconds, and then said something that would sting forever. "You know," Ziza began, flipping her hair, "Nkosi deserves someone more modern, someone who matches his level. You're just a housewife." The words hit Habiba like a slap. She froze, the knife in her hand still pressing on the tomato. Her heart sank, her ears rang, but she didn't let Ziza see the pain on her face. She kept her back straight and her voice calm. In that moment, Habiba didn't feel like herself. She was standing in her own kitchen, the one she had designed, the one she had cooked in for years, and suddenly it felt like she didn't belong there, like she had become a guest in her own home, a stranger. Ziza wasn't just taking Nkosi's attention anymore. She was taking away something deeper, her respect, her place, her value. Habiba remembered all the nights she stayed up waiting for Nkosi, all the meals she prepared, the clothes she washed, the times she held him when he was stressed. She remembered praying with him, fasting with him, helping him build his business from scratch. And now, here was Ziza, calling her just a housewife, like none of that meant anything. Later that evening, Habiba tried to talk to Nkosi about it. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She simply told him what Ziza had said, hoping he would at least be shocked, maybe upset, but he didn't even blink. Instead, Nkosi looked tired and said, "Maybe you two need to sit and talk. Maybe you should apologize and fix the tension." Habiba stood there in silence. Apologize? For what? For being disrespected in her own house? For being loyal? She didn't say much. She just looked at him, the man she had loved so deeply. And for the first time, she didn't recognize him. She nodded slowly and whispered, "Noted." Then she turned and walked away. She didn't cry that night, not because it didn't hurt. It did. But because something inside her had changed. The tears weren't falling anymore. The silence wasn't fear. It was clarity. Ziza had called her just a housewife. But what Nkosi didn't know was that housewife was about to become something much more. Habiba stopped talking much after that day, not because she had given up, but because she had finally opened her eyes. She realized no one was coming to save her. Not her family, not Nkosi, not even the man she had loved for so many years. So instead of wasting more words, she went quiet. But her silence wasn't weakness, it was planning. While Nkosi and Ziza laughed loudly in the living room, watching movies, playing music, and acting like nothing was wrong, Habiba sat alone in the bedroom, organizing papers. She wasn't crying anymore, she was thinking. She began making copies of every important document, house papers, bank statements, business file. Slowly, quietly, she started transferring some of her shares, savings, and little properties into her own name. No one noticed. No one asked. She found a quiet lawyer named Omari through a friend. He didn't ask too many questions either. He just listened, nodded, and gave her a plan. He told her what to do step by step. Habiba followed every instruction carefully, like a woman who had no room left for mistakes. She showed up at the law office with a soft smile and left with a folder full of power. Back at home, nothing looked different. She still made dinner on time. She still ironed Nkosi's clothes, folded his socks, and placed his wallet near the door. She didn't stop doing anything. That's what made it so easy for Nkosi to ignore her. He thought she had accepted everything, but behind her calm face, a storm was building. Not loud, not violent, but strong. Her hands looked steady, but her heart had changed. She no longer waited for his attention. She no longer hoped for Ziza to leave. She had already decided that when she left, she would never look back. Even her shadow looked peaceful, but only because she had made peace with one thing. She was done fighting for someone who didn't fight for her. No one could see it, but Habiba was no longer the same woman who stood quietly in the kitchen hoping to be seen. She was now the woman planning her escape, her future, her freedom. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She smiled, served dinner, and counted down the days. Because when a quiet woman starts moving in silence, she's no longer broken. She's becoming unstoppable. One quiet morning, Nkosi sat at the dining table and said calmly, "Ziza will be moving in, just for a while. She'll stay in the guest room." Habiba didn't respond. She just nodded and continued stirring her tea. But deep inside, she knew the guest room wouldn't stay a guest room for long. And she also knew she wasn't going to fight anymore. What Nkosi didn't know was that Habiba had already moved on, not with another man, but with her life. She had quietly rented a small apartment across town, under her friend's name. It wasn't big, but it was peaceful. It had light. It had silence. It had space for her to breathe. She had also registered her own business, something she had always dreamed of. A small handmade soap brand, made from local herbs and oils she used to mix for fun. She named it after her late grandmother, the only woman who had ever told her she was strong. Orders were already coming in from a few local stores. Step by step, Habiba was building something of her own. Ziza walked into the house a few days later, like she owned it. She moved around with loud perfume, high heels, and confidence. She placed her bags in the guest room, smiled sweetly, and acted like everything was normal. But she didn't know the history behind the walls she now called home. The guest bed she laid on. That was where Habiba cried for hours when Nkosi didn't come home. The curtains in the room. Habiba had stitched them with her own hands during her pregnancy. Every corner of the house held pieces of Habiba's pain and prayers, things Ziza could never understand. But Habiba didn't say a word. She still cooked dinner. She still kept the house clean. But her heart wasn't there anymore. She had already let go. Ziza thought she had won something, but she was only stepping into what Habiba had already left behind. Habiba's eyes no longer followed Nkosi. Her thoughts no longer circled around his actions. Her focus was on her business, her peace, and the quiet apartment waiting for her across town. And when she finally lay down at night, it wasn't on tear-soaked sheets anymore. It was on clean ones she bought for herself, ones that carried no memories, no pain, only new beginnings. Because while Ziza moved in, Habiba had already moved on. It was a cold, quiet night when Nkosi came home, his face filled with anger. He didn't greet Habiba. He didn't ask how her day went. He just walked straight into the kitchen and shouted, "Ziza says you disrespected her today. You need to apologize. Be a woman." Habiba was washing the last plate from dinner. She paused for a second, wiped her hands gently on a towel, and turned around. Her face was calm. Not a single tear, not a single shake, just silence. Nkosi stood there, still fuming, waiting for her to argue, to beg, or maybe even cry. But Habiba did none of that. She slowly walked out of the kitchen and into the dining room, the same place where years ago she and Nkosi had cut their small wedding cake. That night had been full of dreams, laughter, and promises. But now, all she could feel was emptiness. She reached for a brown envelope sitting quietly on the side table. She had placed it there earlier that day, knowing deep in her heart that the moment was coming. She walked back to the dining table and gently placed it in front of him. "You want peace?" she said softly. "Then sign this." Nkosi looked down at the envelope, confused. He opened it and saw the first page, divorce papers. His smile faded. "What is this?" he asked, voice low. Habiba didn't raise her voice. She simply said, "I'm tired, Nkosi. Tired of being invisible in my own home. Tired of being told to say sorry when I've done nothing wrong. You chose her, and now I'm choosing myself." Nkosi tried to speak, but Habiba shook her head gently. "You told me to be a woman. This is what a woman does when she's had enough." She stood there, strong and steady, not with anger, but with quiet power. For so long she had stayed silent. For so long she had been patient. But that night she spoke louder than ever, without shouting a single word. Nkosi didn't expect this. He thought she would always stay, always forgive, always stay small so he could feel big. But she had grown, and now she was done asking for respect. She was claiming it. That brown envelope held more than just papers. It held her courage, her freedom, her final answer. And as she turned and walked away from the table, her steps were calm. Her heart was finally at peace. Because she didn't just walk away from Nkosi, she walked back to herself. Nkosi sat at the table with the brown envelope in front of him, his expression changing from anger to amusement. He picked it up, opened it casually, and glanced at the first page. A soft chuckle escaped his lips. "This is a joke, right?" he said, still trying to act like he was in control. Habiba said nothing. She stood a few feet away, watching him quietly, her hands folded calmly in front of her. She had no smile, no anger, just peace, the kind that comes when you already know the ending. Nkosi flipped to the second page. His eyes scanned the list carefully. That's when the smile on his face began to fade. The properties, the savings accounts, the joint investments, everything was already moved, legally and cleanly, to separate names, to hers. He blinked, a little confused now, and turned to the third page. His jaw tightened. It was a custody agreement. Not that they had children yet, but she had included every possible outcome. Visits, responsibilities, boundaries. Everything was clear, prepared, and signed. Then he got to the fourth page, and that's where he paused. Witness signatures, her lawyer's stamp, her friend's name, her quiet preparation, all right in front of him. His hands started shaking just a little, his voice softer now. "Wait, what is this?" he asked, barely above a whisper. Habiba looked him in the eyes and said gently, "A goodbye letter." Nkosi didn't know what to say. He had never expected this. Not from the woman who once waited up for him every night. Not from the woman who always forgave him, even when he didn't deserve it. He thought she would always stay. But now, the proof was in his hands, and it was final. She had made her move without noise, without warning. She had loved him in silence, and now she was leaving him in silence too. Nkosi tried to speak again, But the words didn't come. He looked at the papers like they were written in another language, trying to understand how she had done all this without him noticing. But Habiba didn't need to explain. Everything he needed to know was already written, not just on paper, but in the empty space between them, the space he created by choosing someone else over and over again. She turned to leave, and as she walked away, Nkosi realized something. He didn't just lose a wife that night. He lost the one woman who had loved him when he had nothing, and who left him only when she had found herself. After the divorce, Ziza wasted no time making everything public. She posted pictures of herself and Nkosi on social media, smiling and showing off the house that once belonged to Habiba. She even captioned one of her photos, "He chose me." Some people are just bitter when they lose. It was clear the message was for Habiba. The comments were filled with laughing emojis, support from strangers, and more jabs at Habiba. But Habiba didn't reply. She didn't defend herself or try to argue. She had already left that chapter behind. Her focus was on something far more important, her new beginning. A few weeks later, she held the official launch of her handmade soap brand. What started as a quiet side dream had now become a full business. She rented a small hall, decorated it beautifully, and invited women from her community, especially those who had gone through pain, heartbreak, or betrayal. More than 200 women showed up. Some were her old friends. Some were strangers who had followed her quiet strength from afar, but they all came to support her. As the launch began, Habiba stood on stage wearing a simple white dress, her hair tied back neatly. There was no sadness in her eyes, only light. She held the microphone and began to speak. "I was once told I was just a housewife," she said, looking around the room. "I was told to be quiet for peace. I was told to apologize when I did nothing wrong. And when I finally walked away, I was called bitter." The room went silent. Some women wiped their eyes already. "But walking away is not weakness," she continued. "It's wisdom. It's knowing when to stop pouring your heart into a cup that's already full of someone else's lies." Her voice didn't shake. She wasn't there for revenge. She was there to rise. The women clapped. Some stood up. Many cried. In that moment, Habiba wasn't just a businesswoman. She was a voice for every woman who had ever been made to feel small. She later posted a short video of her speech on her own page. No captions, no shade, no replies to Ziza. Just the words, "This is what freedom looks like." It went viral. Thousands of women shared it. Some wrote, "This gave me strength." Others commented, "I needed this today." Ziza may have been chosen by Nkosi, but Habiba had chosen herself. And that was the most powerful choice of all. It was raining softly the evening Nkosi showed up. The streets were quiet, and the sky was grey. Habiba was inside her small soap shop, arranging new orders on the shelf. Her shop wasn't big, but it smelled of fresh lavender and peace. It was her safe space, one she built from the pieces of her broken heart. She heard the knock on the glass door and looked up. There he was, Nkosi, standing in the rain without an umbrella, his clothes wet and his eyes unsure. For a moment, he just stood there, watching her through the glass. Then he slowly opened the door. "Habiba," he said quietly, stepping inside, dripping water on the floor. "We can fix this. I made mistakes, but we can still fix it." Habiba didn't rush to speak. She didn't move toward him. Instead, she calmly placed the last soap on the shelf, wiped her hands with a towel, and turned around to face him. She looked at the man she once prayed for, the man she cried for, the man she stayed up waiting for while he was out with someone else. But this time, her heart felt nothing. No pain, no anger, just peace. She walked to her counter and picked up a small box. Inside were a few printed photos, screenshots of the messages Ziza had sent, pictures from their social media posts, and moments that once tore her apart. She didn't throw the box at him. She simply opened it and placed it on the table between them. Nkosi looked at the photos. His shoulders sank. He didn't speak. "I forgave you," Habiba said, her voice soft but firm. "A long time ago." Nkosi looked up, hopeful for a second, but before he could say anything she added, "But I never forgot me." Those words hit him harder than any anger ever could. She walked over to the door and opened it slowly. The rain was still falling, her shop was still warm, and her heart was still hers. "You didn't lose me today," she said gently. "You lost me the moment you thought I would stay after breaking me." Nkosi stood there, speechless. There was nothing left to say. No more apologies, no more promises. Habiba had already left, not just the house, but the version of herself that begged for love. And as he stepped back into the rain, She closed the door quietly behind him, turned the sign to closed, and smiled. Not because he was gone, but because she was finally free. Months had passed since Habiba walked away from the life that once broke her. In that time, she had grown, not just in business, but in strength, in confidence, and in purpose. She had started with one small soap shop, but now her products were in stores across the region. People didn't just buy her soaps, they believed in her story. So, when the organizers of a big women's conference called her to speak, she didn't hesitate. She said yes, not for fame, but for the women who still felt trapped in silence, the women who believed they weren't enough. On the day of the event, Habiba walked into the hall wearing a deep blue dress, her natural curls pinned up, her face glowing, not with makeup, but with peace. The room was filled with women, young, old, married, divorced, heartbroken, healing. They all waited, curious to hear the woman who turned her pain into power. When she stepped on stage, the room fell quiet. She didn't start with tears or stories of betrayal. She started with a smile. "Sometimes love blinds us," she said gently, "but dignity wakes us." There was a hush in the air, the kind that comes when truth touches wounds. I stayed in a love that didn't love me back. I begged to be chosen while forgetting to choose myself. But when I left, I didn't just walk out of a house. I walked back into myself. The crowd clapped, some with tears in their eyes. She shared her journey, the betrayal, the loneliness, the rebuilding. She spoke of late nights mixing soaps, of women who came to her store not just for products, but for strength. She spoke of how she healed, not by waiting for an apology, but by becoming someone who didn't need one anymore. Meanwhile, in a quiet house far away, Nkosi sat alone on a couch. The TV flickered in front of him. On the screen, there she was, Habiba, standing tall, a full room clapping for her, loving her, admiring her. Ziza was gone. The once loud house was now empty. No laughter, no footsteps, just silence. As he watched Habiba speak, it finally hit him. He hadn't just lost a woman, he had lost a queen. And the worst part, he had asked the wrong woman to apologize. Share this if you've ever stayed silent too long for someone who didn't deserve your peace. Tag a queen who found her voice.